100 miles per hour. That's the speed prosecutors say Mackenzie Shirilla reached before her vehicle slammed into a commercial building in Strongsville, Ohio. 2 teenage boys lost their lives. Mackenzie Shirilla survived. At first glance, it looked like a horrific crash, but as investigators pieced together the evidence, they came to a very different conclusion. They believed this wasn't an accident. They believed it was murder. I'm Buffy, an attorney, and this is Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. Tonight, we're going to examine one of the most debated criminal cases in recent years. Not by asking what social media believes, but by examining what the law required the prosecution to prove, what the defense argued, and why the courts reached the decisions they did. Chapter 1, the morning everything changed. Ultimately, they were out at 5 in the morning. Mackenzie Shirilla was the girlfriend of Dom Russo, and Davion Flanagan was his best friend. Ultimately, they had been engaging in essentially a sleepover is what they called it, with all of their friends. And essentially, some people had been using marijuana, some people had been using mushrooms. And so ultimately, there was a backstory in which it is believed that Dominic was considering breaking up with Mackenzie. And so the drive, it was proven that she never let her foot off the accelerator. She had gone 100 miles an hour through the whole trip. And then there was an impact in which she hit a vehicle, which took the lives of both Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. And so let's talk about the investigation. Ultimately, they conducted a crash reconstruction because they were concerned because there was a slipper that essentially looked to be stuck to the floor of the vehicle. And so there was crash reconstruction wondering if it had been a defective issue with the vehicle, which they later determined no. They also were looking at the vehicle data, which is how then they were able to determine the speed and that she never slowed down at all. They were also able to analyze the steering as well as the braking, which the brake was never used. And ultimately, there was also some cell phone evidence, especially because I believe it was Dominic Russo's mother, who indicated that someone had actually heard her say that she's going to wreck the vehicle. And this was 2 weeks prior to the deaths of both Dominic and Davion. And so ultimately witness testimony as well, talking about, the volatility of the relationship, how he was trying to get out, also kind of laid some groundwork. And then ultimately, what story did investigators believe the evidence was telling? I think that that's extremely important. So Chapter 3, murder. Ultimately, the purpose of this is to determine whether she had the mindset, whether she pre-planned this, what was her purpose in doing this, in putting those two boys in the car with her as she's driving 100 miles per hour. And if you watch the documentary, you will see that it is very clear that she is really traveling at a high rate of speed, as well as intent. Was her intent to essentially harm everyone in the vehicle, or was that a side issue? There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that was used, given the fact that some people were saying that he was getting tired of kind of being controlled and he was looking to potentially get out. An intent is very rarely proved by direct evidence. It's ultimately circumstantial evidence based on the defendant's own words, based on what other people have witnessed. And the prosecution wasn't required to prove what Mackenzie was thinking. They were required to prove that the evidence supported the conclusion that she acted purposely beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond any and all doubt, but beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think that the idea that you were traveling at 5 a.m. in the morning after, having done a sleepover, and literally using mushrooms and all sorts of other things, that it was a likely conclusion that this would come to this. And so ultimately, let's talk about the defense. Medical issues were raised. One of those was the POTS. POTS essentially causes people to pass out and things like that. Her mother was cross-examined and asked if, knowing that her daughter had POTS, why would she advocate for her daughter to get her license? Her mother said because, she doesn't always pass out. Additionally, there's also the idea of a possible loss of consciousness. However, from what I saw, excuse me, and I haven't been able to dig through the appellate record and things like that, that there didn't seem to be any defense experts, or if they were, they weren't shown on camera, as well as alternative explanations. Maybe Mackenzie wasn't really focused on what she was doing. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she fell asleep at the wheel, any number of things like that. And additionally, I want to talk about why a bench trial. Ultimately, people are entitled to have a jury of their peers, meaning similar people. So if you are a different ethnic group from Caucasian, you have the right to have people similar to you be on the jury listening to your case. If you don't, then you might potentially have an issue, or the prosecution might have an issue with the Batson challenge, which is when you are not following that rule. The other thing is, it may have been decided with doing a jury waiver that potentially the jury might be too emotional, given the fact that two people were ultimately harmed. And whatever strategic reasons that he had, maybe he thought that it would be easier for a judge to be more lenient potentially, or give her some grace there, or potentially not throw the book at her. The pros ultimately are, of course, the judge knows the law. The judge is going to do what's fair because that is their duty. The judge has dealt with a lot of cases and handled a lot of trials, both bench and jury. The cons are, you don't know what the jury would have done. Would they have had sympathy for this 17-year-old girl? Or would they have been like, well, she should have known better? Or would other character evidence that potentially painted her in a negative light also came out, which would have made things potentially difficult? But I did hear that the judge said, you're most likely going to spend the rest of your life in prison. So it was a very serious thing. And so ultimately, I think sometimes a jury can be a little bit more lenient on people than a judge who has all that experience. And ultimately, judges look at rulings as cut and dry for the most part. And so it's not over yet, because ultimately she was found guilty for both of the deaths. She was sentenced. As I said, they think that she's likely going to spend the rest of her life in prison unless there's something that comes up that potentially helps her. And then also she has appeals that she can potentially look into. What I would say ultimately is this is an extremely nuanced, unusual case, because you can look at any number of facts and it's not clear cut. I think the fact that, and I want to go into another case that I've done before, Scott Peterson. When you go into Scott Peterson, I don't think Scott Peterson would have been convicted, but for, he said that his wife had died when she was still alive at that point, and he had had an affair. And oftentimes jurors, especially, very hypersensitive jurors, are going to latch onto that as a reason or a motive for why he killed his wife, or why they believe that he killed his wife. With Mackenzie, the thing that she had her volatility. They had a lot of videos of her. Case in point, at one point, she had actually was a corpse for Halloween, like right after the time that the two gentlemen were deceased. So that didn't look very well. But again, I mean, she's a 17-year-old girl. And I don't think, sometimes you don't think about the consequences of those actions. Not making excuses for her, though. But ultimately, it can be really difficult to potentially make that leap. I mean, yes, that could be a motive, but also just being reckless, just being a teenager who thinks that you're invincible can also result in the distorted thinking. And let's talk about the reason that the trial court is the original finder of fact, because they hear the original people who are testifying. They see their mannerisms, they see their characteristics, because there is a huge difference with me talking to you right now and you being able to hear me and look at me and read my body language and my facial expressions than to read something that is typed out as an appellate record. Because the judge saw the initial trial. That is why they're the trier of fact. The appellate court looks for mistakes made by the trial court. And they're not going to completely retry the case because that would be almost duplicative. Cases like this challenge us because they force us to confront difficult questions about intent, evidence, and accountability. Whether you agree with the outcome or not, understanding how courts analyze these questions helps us become better informed citizens. Justice isn't simply about reaching a conclusion. It's about reaching the conclusion through law, evidence, and due process. I'm Buffy. This is Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. I'm an almost 18-year criminal defense attorney, and if you got value from this, please consider liking and subscribing. Have a great day. Bye-bye.